James Earl Ray, the man convicted of assassinating Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., spent decades behind bars before his death in 1998. But his time in prison was marked by violence and conspiracy theories that would follow him until his final days. While Ray himself wasn't killed in prison, dying instead from complications of hepatitis C, his presence in the penal system was associated with several violent incidents that illuminate the dangerous world faced by political assassins behind bars. Ray was involved in a stabbing incident at Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary in Tennessee, where he was attacked by fellow inmates who viewed him with a mixture of hatred and contempt. The prison environment surrounding high-profile assassins often breeds violence, as these individuals become targets for other inmates seeking notoriety or revenge. Ray's case exemplifies how political assassins face unique dangers behind bars, caught between those who view them as heroes and those who see them as the worst kind of criminal. Throughout his imprisonment, Ray maintained his innocence and claimed he was a patsy in a larger conspiracy. This stance made him even more controversial among inmates, some of whom believed he was lying to escape responsibility for one of the 20th century's most heinous crimes. The tension this created followed Ray through multiple prison transfers and shaped his decades of incarceration. Jeffrey Dahmer. On November 28, 1994, one of America's most notorious serial killers met his end in the bathroom of a Wisconsin prison in an attack that shocked the nation. Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee Cannibal who had murdered 17 young men and boys in acts of unspeakable horror, was beaten to death by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver in what many saw as inevitable justice. Dahmer had been sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in 1992, but his time in prison would last just 2 years. Scarver, who was serving a life sentence for murder, attacked Dahmer and another inmate, Jesse Anderson, with a metal bar from the prison weight room. Scarver later claimed that Dahmer's lack of remorse and his disturbing habit of fashioning his prison food into severed limbs as a macabre joke had provoked the attack. The murders occurred while the three men were on work detail cleaning a prison gymnasium bathroom. Prison staff were criticized for leaving the three inmates unsupervised, especially given Dahmer's notoriety and the threats that had been made against his life. Scarver struck Dahmer twice in the head, causing massive trauma that proved fatal. Dahmer was pronounced dead an hour later at a nearby hospital. The attack raised serious questions about prison safety protocols and whether officials had done enough to protect even the most reviled inmates. Scarver later claimed in interviews that he had been disgusted by Dahmer's attitude and felt he was doing the world a favor. Some observers noted that Dahmer seemed almost resigned to his fate, as if he knew his crimes would eventually catch up with him behind bars. His death became a cautionary tale about the limits of protective custody and the violent code of justice that operates in prisons. James Whitey Bulger. James Bulger was one of Boston's most feared mob bosses and spent 16 years as a fugitive on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list before his dramatic capture. After being found in 2011, he was convicted of 11 murders and sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences plus 5 years. On October 30th, 2018, just hours after being transferred to United States Penitentiary Hazleton in West Virginia, the 89-year-old Bulger was found dead in his cell in a killing that raised serious questions about institutional failures. He had been beaten so severely that his eyes were nearly gouged out, and he was left in a gruesome state that shocked even hardened prison officials who had seen countless acts of violence. 3 inmates were eventually charged with the killing, including Fotios Freddy Gaesch, a Massachusetts mobster who allegedly hated informants with a passion. Bulger had served as an FBI informant during his criminal career, providing information on rival gangs while being protected by corrupt federal agents. This made him a marked man in any prison, where the code against rats is enforced with brutal efficiency. The speed of the attack, occurring within hours of his arrival, suggested it was planned in advance, possibly with information leaked from inside the prison system itself. Questions arose about why prison officials transferred an elderly, high-profile inmate to one of the most dangerous federal prisons in the country, especially given the facility's history of violence and its nickname, Misery Mountain. Bulger's family filed wrongful death claims, arguing that the Bureau of Prisons essentially sent him to his execution. The case highlighted systemic problems in how high-risk inmates are managed and protected, or in some cases, deliberately exposed to danger as a form of extrajudicial punishment. Thomas Silverstein. The Aryan Brotherhood, America's oldest major white supremacist prison gang, has been responsible for countless murders both inside and outside prison walls. Thomas Silverstein, known as Terrible Tom, was an Aryan Brotherhood member who killed 2 fellow inmates and a corrections officer at the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. After murdering correctional officer Merle Klutz in 1983 by stabbing him multiple times in a vicious attack, Silverstein was placed in solitary confinement, where he would spend the next 36 years, longer than any other federal prisoner in isolation. While Silverstein himself died of heart complications in 2018 rather than being murdered, the violence associated with Aryan Brotherhood leadership has claimed numerous lives behind bars. Members who fall out of favor with the organization or attempt to leave are often targeted for assassination in attacks that are swift and brutal. The gang operates with military-like efficiency, using coded messages and a blood-in, blood-out philosophy that makes leaving the organization nearly impossible. Leaders who cooperate with authorities or show weakness are marked for death, and these executions are carried out with brutal precision to send messages to other potential informants. Silverstein's decades in isolation made him a symbol of the supermax prison system and raised debates about whether such extreme confinement constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. His case also illustrated how prison gang violence creates cycles that lead to ever more restrictive conditions, transforming some inmates into living ghosts who exist in complete isolation from human contact. The Aryan Brotherhood continues to operate in prisons across America, and their willingness to kill their own members for perceived infractions creates an atmosphere of constant fear and paranoia. Albert DeSalvo. Albert DeSalvo confessed to being the Boston Strangler, claiming responsibility for 13 murders in the Boston area during the early 1960s that terrorized the entire city. However, he was never actually convicted of these murders due to lack of physical evidence linking him to the crimes. Instead, he was serving a life sentence for armed robbery and sexual assault when he was killed in 1973 at Walpole State Prison in Massachusetts. DeSalvo was stabbed to death in the prison infirmary, and his murder has never been officially solved despite numerous investigations over the decades. Some investigators believe he was killed because he was about to recant his Boston Strangler confession, which would have embarrassed law enforcement and reopened one of the most notorious unsolved crime sprees in American history. Others suggest it was simply prison violence unrelated to his infamous claims, perhaps a dispute over contraband or a personal grudge. The case remains one of the most debated in true crime history, with DNA evidence decades later providing some support for his guilt in at least one of the Strangler murders. His death in prison eliminated any possibility of a full trial or complete accounting of the crimes, leaving victims' families without definitive closure. DeSalvo's murder also raised questions about whether he had actually committed all the murders he confessed to, or whether he had falsely taken credit for crimes committed by others in an attempt to gain notoriety. The mystery surrounding both his guilt and his death has made the Boston Strangler case one of the most enduring enigmas in criminal history. Pedro Rodrigues Filho. Brazil's most prolific serial killer, Pedro Rodrigues Filho, killed over 100 people during his lifetime, including at least 47 fellow inmates, while imprisoned in one of the most shocking murder sprees in prison history. Known as Pedrinho Matador, or Killer Petey, he began his murder spree at age 14 after a troubled childhood marked by violence. What made him unique was that he primarily targeted other criminals, viewing himself as a vigilante, delivering justice that the system couldn't or wouldn't provide. During his time in various Brazilian prisons, he killed rival gang members, rapists, and inmates he deemed deserving of death based on his own moral code. Ironically, despite his murderous rampage behind bars, Filho was eventually released from prison after serving 34 years. His sentence reduced for good behavior and because Brazilian law at the time limited sentences to 30 years. However, his freedom was short-lived and far from peaceful. In March 2023, Pedro was shot and killed in an ambush in Sao Paulo, Brazil, by unknown assailants who likely held grudges from his criminal past. While he died outside prison walls, his death was the direct result of his criminal activities and the enemies he made during his decades of incarceration. His case represents an unusual reversal where the infamous prison killer eventually became the victim, suggesting that the violence of prison life often extends beyond the walls and follows individuals long after their release. Filho had become something of a folk hero to some segments of Brazilian society who viewed his targeting of criminals as rough justice, but this fame also made him a target for those seeking revenge or reputation. Carl Tuffy Reed. The world of prison gangs is marked by shifting alliances and brutal enforcement of codes that govern every aspect of life behind bars. Carl Tuffy Reed was a black guerrilla family gang member at California's San Quentin State Prison when he was murdered in 1987 in a killing that illustrated the dangerous politics of prison gang leadership. The black guerrilla family was formed in the California prison system in 1966 as both a political organization inspired by radical movements and a criminal enterprise dealing in drugs and extortion. Reed's killing was part of an internal power struggle within the gang, demonstrating how prison gang leadership positions are often secured through violence rather than democratic processes. These organizations operate sophisticated criminal networks both inside and outside prison, dealing in drugs, extortion, and contract killings that generate millions of dollars in revenue. When leaders show weakness, challenge the wrong person, or violate gang codes, they become targets marked for death. Reed's assassination was carried out by fellow gang members who felt he was no longer fit to lead or had betrayed the organization's principles. His death barely made headlines outside California, but within the prison system, it sent shockwaves through gang hierarchies and altered the balance of power in several institutions across the state. The black guerrilla family continues to operate in prisons today, though it has splintered into various factions with different goals and methods. Reed's murder serves as a reminder that prison gang leadership is perhaps the most dangerous position in the criminal underworld, where trust is scarce and betrayal is met with immediate lethal force. Kenneth McDuff. Kenneth McDuff was a serial killer who committed his first murders in 1966, killing 3 teenagers in Texas in brutal attacks that shocked the community. He was sentenced to death, but his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment when the Supreme Court temporarily suspended capital punishment in 1972. Shockingly, he was paroled in 1989 due to prison overcrowding, despite his horrific crimes and the protests of prosecutors and victims' families. After his release, McDuff killed at least 9 more people, making him one of the few death row inmates whose release directly led to additional murders. He was recaptured, convicted again, and executed by lethal injection in 1998. While McDuff died by execution rather than at the hands of fellow inmates, his case sparked outrage and led to reforms in the Texas parole system. His presence in prison before his ill-fated release created a climate of fear, as he was known for his violent temper and lack of remorse. Other inmates who crossed him often faced violent retaliation, and even guards were wary of his explosive nature. The McDuff case became a rallying point for victims' rights advocates and those arguing against parole for violent offenders, fundamentally changing how Texas and other states handle the release of dangerous criminals. Rodolfo Cadena, the Mexican Mafia, also known as La M, is one of the most powerful prison gangs in the United States, controlling drug distribution and extortion operations worth millions. Rodolfo Cheyenne Cadena was one of the gang's earliest and most influential leaders, helping to shape the organization that would become a dominant force in prisons throughout the American Southwest. Co-founding the organization in the late 1950s at the DeSalvo Vocational Institution in California, Cadena helped establish the Mexican Mafia's code and structure, creating a blueprint that would be followed for decades. However, even powerful gang leaders aren't immune to prison violence, as Cadena would tragically discover. In December 1972, Cadena was attacked by members of the Nuestra Familia, a rival prison gang formed by Northern California Hispanics who resented the Southern California dominance of the Mexican Mafia at Chino State Prison. During the attack, Cadena was stabbed multiple times while in the recreation yard, surrounded by enemies who had planned the assault carefully. Despite his reputation as a fierce fighter and his position of power within the prison hierarchy, he succumbed to his wounds before guards could intervene effectively. His death marked a significant moment in California prison gang history and intensified the war between the Mexican Mafia and Nuestra Familia that continues to this day, claiming hundreds of lives both inside and outside prison walls. The killing demonstrated that in the prison hierarchy, no one is untouchable, and past allegiances offer no protection when gang politics shift. Cadena's legacy lives on in the Mexican Mafia's continued influence, though the organization he helped create has evolved far beyond what he might have envisioned. Sam Giancana. While Chicago mob boss Sam Giancana was murdered before he could be imprisoned for the crimes he was being investigated for, his death is intrinsically linked to what he might have revealed from behind bars. Giancana was a major figure in organized crime and had alleged connections to the CIA plots to assassinate Fidel Castro and possible involvement in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. In 1975, as he was about to testify before a Senate committee investigating CIA activities, Giancana was murdered in his Oak Park, Illinois home. He was shot 7 times, including once in the mouth, a symbolic mob hit suggesting he had talked too much or was about to reveal secrets. The parallels to prison informant killings are striking and deliberate. Giancana's death was essentially a preemptive strike to prevent him from becoming a jailhouse informant, a fate that many mobsters consider worse than death. Had he lived to be imprisoned, he would have likely been a high-value target for assassination, much like later mob bosses who cooperated with authorities. The mob has a long history of reaching into prisons to silence potential witnesses, using connections with prison gangs or corrupt officials to carry out hits. Giancana's murder sent a clear message to anyone considering cooperation with law enforcement. There is no place safe enough, not even behind bars with protective custody, to escape the mob's reach and willingness to eliminate threats to the organization. Gonzalo Rodrigues, Gacha. Gonzalo Rodrigues Gacha, known as the Mexican, was a leader of the Medellin cartel alongside Pablo Escobar during the height of Colombia's drug wars. While Rodrigues Gacha was killed by Colombian police in 1989 before serving significant prison time, his organization's reach into prisons demonstrates the blurred lines between incarceration and criminal power in the drug trade. Drug cartel leaders who end up imprisoned often continue running their operations from behind bars, using corrupt guards, smuggled cell phones, and networks of lawyers to maintain control of their empires. But they also become vulnerable to rival organizations and government forces who see imprisonment as an opportunity to eliminate competition. In Colombia, during the height of the drug wars, prisons were battlegrounds where cartel members were assassinated by rivals who had infiltrated the institutions through bribery or by placing their own members inside. Rodrigues Gacha's death, while trying to avoid capture, highlights how drug lords often prefer death to the uncertainty of prison, where their power diminishes and they become targets. His associates who were captured and imprisoned faced constant assassination attempts from rival cartels, particularly the Cali cartel, which was locked in a vicious war with the Medellin organization. The violence in Colombian prisons during this era was so severe that some facilities were essentially war zones, where different cartel factions controlled different cell blocks and fought running battles with makeshift weapons. Robert Brown Bob Viramontes. The Nuestra Familia gang, born in California, prisons in the 1960s as a response to Mexican Mafia dominance, established a military-style hierarchy with generals at the top who commanded absolute loyalty. Robert Brown Bob Viramontes was one such general, wielding considerable power within the organization and making life-or-death decisions about members and rivals. However, in 2005, Viramontes was found dead in his cell at California's Pelican Bay State Prison under suspicious circumstances that raised more questions than answers. While authorities initially ruled his death as suicide by hanging, many within the prison system believed he was murdered by his own organization in a killing made to look self-inflicted. Nuestra Familia had a history of killing its own leaders when they were suspected of cooperating with authorities or mismanaging gang business in ways that threatened the organization. The gang operated drug distribution networks, extortion rackets, and ordered hits on enemies both inside and outside prison, generating substantial revenue that had to be carefully managed. Viramontes' death, whether suicide or homicide, reflected the intense pressure faced by gang leaders in maximum security facilities where paranoia runs high. The paranoia of prison gang culture means that leaders must constantly prove their loyalty and effectiveness or face deadly consequences from their own members. Some speculated that Viramontes had been skimming money from gang operations or had been in contact with law enforcement, either of which would have been a death sentence within the organization's strict code. William Wild Bill Cutolo. William Cutolo was a high-ranking member of the Colombo crime family who disappeared in May 1999 under mysterious circumstances that the mob initially tried to cover up. His body wasn't discovered until 2008, buried in a lot on Long Island, ending years of speculation about his fate. While Cutolo wasn't killed inside a prison, his murder was ordered because of what he might say if imprisoned, making his case relevant to understanding prison-related mob violence. He had been involved in a power struggle within the Colombo family and was seen as a threat by acting boss Alphonse Persico, who feared Cutolo's growing influence. The hit was ordered and carried out while Cutolo was potentially facing criminal charges that could have sent him to prison, where the pressure to cooperate with prosecutors might have become overwhelming. Like Sam Giancana, his death represents the preemptive silencing of someone who could become a powerful informant from behind bars, providing testimony that could bring down entire crime families. The mob has a long history of eliminating members before they can cut deals with prosecutors, calculating that the risk of letting them live to face imprisonment is too great. Cutolo's son later testified that his father's murder was specifically motivated by fears he would cooperate with authorities if arrested, a common concern that has led to numerous mob-related killings over the decades. The case illustrates how the fear of imprisonment and what someone might say to reduce their sentence drives much of the violence in organized crime. Imprisoned Terrorists. High-profile terrorists imprisoned in the United States and abroad face unique dangers from fellow inmates, including those from rival extremist groups with competing ideologies or agendas. While specific cases are often classified for security reasons to protect ongoing investigations and intelligence operations, incidents have occurred where imprisoned terrorists have been attacked by other inmates who view them as traitors to their cause or enemies of their own ideological beliefs. In some cases, imprisoned terrorists have been killed by inmates who lost family members in terrorist attacks and sought personal revenge, acting as vigilantes within the prison system. The case of Ali Hassan Abu Kamal, who opened fire on the observation deck of the Empire State Building in 1997, ended with his suicide rather than imprisonment, but his stated motives reflected the violent ideologies that often clash within prison walls. More recently, individuals who were radicalized and involved in terrorist activities have been allegedly targeted by other inmates while in custody, though details often remain sealed. The prison system must carefully segregate these individuals to prevent both their victimization and their recruitment of other inmates to extremist causes, a delicate balance that doesn't always succeed. Radicalization behind bars has become a serious concern for prison officials, as charismatic extremists can convert vulnerable inmates to their causes, creating new security threats that extend beyond the prison walls when these converts are eventually released into society. Larry Nassar. Larry Nassar, the former USA gymnastics doctor convicted of sexually assaulting hundreds of young athletes under the guise of medical treatment, was attacked just hours after being released from protective custody at United States Penitentiary Tucson in May 2018. Inmate Shane McMillan, who was serving time for assaulting a police officer, beat Nassar so severely that he suffered serious injuries, though he survived the assault. Nassar had been in protective custody precisely because prison officials knew he would be a target, as sex offenders face universal condemnation in prison culture. Sex offenders, particularly those who victimize children, are at the bottom of the prison hierarchy and face constant danger from other inmates who view them with disgust and contempt. The attack on Nassar highlighted the challenges of protecting high-profile offenders in federal prisons, where determined inmates will find ways to access their targets. Unlike typical inmates, such prisoners require constant vigilance and separation from the general population, resources that are often stretched thin in overcrowded facilities. While Nassar survived his attack, many sex offenders haven't been as fortunate, falling victim to prison justice that operates outside official channels. The case demonstrates that even with special precautions, determined inmates can find opportunities to carry out vigilante justice against those they deem most despicable, viewing such attacks as a moral duty that enhances their status among other prisoners. Thank you for watching. If you learned anything, let me know by liking the video and comment below on what you would like to see in the future. History never runs out of surprises, and neither do we. So subscribe and join me for the next dive into the archives